Okay, let's make a start. Hello and Happy New Year. I hope everybody's well and surviving under the circumstances. It's a shame we can't be doing this in person, but we hope that we will be able to soon, of course. But thank you for coming anyway and giving us your evening. Tonight we're going to present the latest version of the Net Zero Carbon Roadmap for Leeds. We have a presentation to begin with, and then an interesting combination of a response from two members of the citizens jury who we're really pleased to have with us tonight, because their work and the citizens jury's deliberations gave us a set of recommendations and really informed the development of the roadmap. So they've played a central role in shaping this latest version. And then we have a number of responses from various people, including Leeds City Council from Polly Cook, and Business in the Community from Liz Edgington, and Friends of the Earth from Simon Bowens. So we're looking forward to hearing their comments and then to opening up what we sure will be an engaging and fruitful discussion afterwards. And there'll be lots of time for you to pose questions to the panel and to me after the presentations. Just a few points on how to engage, first of all. The presentations will be first, and then there will be a question and answer session and discussion. It would be great if you can post questions in the Q&A box as we go through. So post them at any time. And then please, if you click on the Q&A box, you will be able to upvote your favorites, and we will prioritize questions according to which ones have the most votes, but also hopefully we'll have plenty of time to get through most of the questions. The attendees will all remain muted unless enabled to speak by the host. So in the Q&A session, we will open up that facility and enable people to participate. Please note that the webinar, including the audio and the slides, will be shared after the event. And if there are any technical problems as we go through, please use the chat function, and there will be someone on the end who will try to help. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available via our website afterwards. And if you're on Twitter and want to contribute that way, then our addresses and so on are below. And please use the hashtag #PecanCities. And there is also a Pecan YouTube channel with the link below as well. So I hope that covers all of the issues that we need to address in advance. But like I said, if there are any issues, please use the chat function and we'll see what we can do to help. Okay, so to introduce myself, I'm Andy Gouldson. I'm the chair of Leeds Climate Commission, and I'm one of the people that has prepared the revised version of the roadmap. So I'm going to go backwards, but it's really important to acknowledge the input of Andrew Sudmond and Millie Duncan, who's with us tonight, and also Robert Williamson, who have worked really hard on doing a lot of the analysis and the number crunching behind the report, but also to acknowledge Kate Locke, who was fantastic in helping to polish up the version that you see today, and also Margot Hansen and Tom Noland, who are central to the work of the Leeds Climate Commission. So although I'm presenting, it's very, very much a team effort, and lots of people deserve a lot of credit for all the hard work they've put into this. So to start, Leeds carbon footprint. We published a roadmap 2 or 3 years ago, and clearly so much has changed in that period that a refresh and the inclusion of more up-to-date data is needed on a regular basis. So this is the latest version of that. Much of the work for this was embarked upon before the pandemic and Pecan, but we will say something about how that and lockdown have impacted on our carbon footprint as a city later on. But in broad terms, since 2000, or between 2000 and 2019, Leeds' scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the emissions associated with our fuel use from gas or petrol or diesel, for example, and also from our electricity use, fell by 40%. And if we forecast forward, then we think that by 2050, bearing in mind the ongoing decarbonisation of electricity and improvements in the efficiency of our homes and cars and so on, that we think that emissions will fall by 50% between 2000 and 2050. So, some reasons for cautious optimism. We have made some progress. We've definitely made a start compared to where we were 20 years ago. But, the do nothing option looking forward doesn't see emissions falling quite so quickly in the next 20, 30 years, certainly as is necessary, but also as has been achieved in the last 20 years. So when we put that in the global context, then Leeds's total share of the global carbon budget in 2020 was 31 million tons. Now, what we mean by this is that the science tells us how much globally can be emitted to give us a good chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of warming. And if we take that number and divide it just on the basis of population, so everybody gets an equal share, so high consuming, high emitting countries and places and people have to come down, but also low emitting countries, places and people can still develop, then Leeds's total carbon budget is around 31 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent or greenhouse gases. In 2020, Leeds's carbon emissions were about 4 million tons. So what that means is that the point at which Leeds will have used up its share of the global carbon budget, consistent with staying within that 1.5 degree threshold, which is so crucial because it prevents us moving into the realms of runaway climate change, where climate change kind of fuels itself through, for example, methane emissions from thawing permafrost, then we will have used up our share of that carbon budget by 2029, which really focuses our minds. And that statistic on its own is underneath the climate emergency declaration, which says, we have 10 years to really tackle this monumental challenge, and we have to treat it with the urgency and the ambition that that implies. Now, to talk a little bit about lockdown and the pandemic, then we think, and these are rather tentative numbers, that during the lockdown period last year, emissions were around 43% lower than normal. And through 2020, they were around 13% lower than normal for Leeds. So that's interesting. It's not the way we would want to reduce carbon emissions, of course. We have to find better, more sustainable, more equitable ways of doing it than that. But it does show that emissions under some circumstances can fall quite radically and quite quickly. But if we look at the longer term, what that means is that those reductions achieved last year, and that doesn't take into account this lockdown, will only delay the point at which Leeds uses up its carbon budget by 2 months. So they're significant in the short term, but in the longer term, it doesn't really change much. We still have to be as ambitious and as determined to reduce our carbon emissions as we move forward. And that obviously stresses the need for a green recovery package. So as we stimulate our economy, as we come out of the pandemic, obviously hopefully sooner than later, we need to lock into a low carbon development path. And as we'll see later, then low carbon really does create an significant opportunity for Leeds to stimulate its economy and tackle some of its social challenges through low carbon action. So there is a great opportunity coming out for us to transition towards a low carbon or as net zero carbon recovery path, as it were. In terms of our carbon footprint, then in 2020, 38% of the city's carbon footprint, I'll speak in a little bit of this analysis, 38% is down to transport. And by 2050, we think that share will be the same. So transport is the dominant issue within the city, and longer distance travel, including aviation, is outside the scope of this, but we'll talk about that in a second. The next biggest sector at the moment is the domestic sector, currently responsible for 26% of the carbon footprint of the city. But by 2050, that will have grown to 33%. So transport and homes are really the two areas where we need to focus most directly. And then industry and public and commercial buildings are also significant. And certainly we need to address those too. We can't only focus on homes and transport. We need to think about those things too. And the size of those two circles gives us a sense of how the size relates to the scale of the carbon footprint. So although it will be 50% down 2050 if we do nothing other than rely on national trends, it will be smaller, but that's nowhere near small enough to comply with our carbon budgets and to do, deliver on our share of the net zero agenda. Now, if we look at the difference between where we're headed if we do nothing and where we need to be to stay within our carbon budget, then the upper of the two lines here, the orange dotted line, shows the business as usual direction of travel, as it were. That is 50% lower by 2050 than it was by 2000. But the black dotted line shows what happens if we translate our carbon budget into steady annual reduction over time. Clearly, earlier reductions are better, but nonetheless, reductions over time, transitioning, and in this case, we've transitioned toward 2050. But that implies going from where we are now to 70% carbon reductions based on 2000 levels by 2025, to 85% by 2030, which really shows the scale of what needs to happen in the next decade, to 95% by 2035, and then gradually moving towards 100% by 2050. So what that means is that we've achieved, factoring in where we are a year later, because the data is lagged a little bit, we've achieved, we think, about a 45% reduction in the last 20 years based on our 2000 levels. And in the next 4 to 5 years, we need to add another 25% to that, which really tells us that we've made some progress, but we really need to accelerate significantly in order to stay within our carbon budgets. So to address the scope of the report, in this report, we focus on scopes 1 and 2, as they're called. So that relates to fuel use, whether it's gas or petrol or diesel, for example, used across the city, and also electricity used, even if it's generated outside the city. If it's used within the city boundaries, then it's included in the analysis here. And that's included or includes fuel and electricity use in houses, in other buildings, public and commercial buildings, in transport within the city, so not longer distance travel, and also in industry. And we look at all of the available options to reduce this energy use and carbon footprint, and also some small scale renewables. So that's what we've done here. However, scope 3 is crucially important. Scope 3 also adds in then the net impact of embedded in the products which we import into Leeds and consume within Leeds. So that is added to our carbon footprint. But also we take away then the export. So things produced in Leeds but consumed elsewhere are allocated, the carbon emissions associated with those are allocated to the consumers elsewhere outside of the city boundaries. And scope 3 also would include the impacts of longer distance travel, both by organizations and residents in the city, including through aviation, which is absolutely crucial, of course. Previous work, which we haven't addressed here, looks at flights. For example, the Commission published an aviation position paper a year or so ago, and that suggests that the flights taken by Leeds residents, including through Leeds Bradford Airport, but not only through Leeds Bradford Airport, would add about 21% to the scope 1 and 2 baseline. So it's significant. And as the other emissions come down, then those flight-related emissions proportionally will go up. Broader consumption-based footprints are significant too. And as an estimate, really, we think that the scope 1 and 2 emissions that we focused on here are only about 40% of the wider scope 3 emissions. So Leeds needs to be a leader in addressing scope 3 emissions. But the reason we haven't addressed them here is that almost all countries and cities focus on their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And very, very few really focus on their broader consumption-based emissions. Even though we can account for those emissions, the policy levers or the other interventions needed to address consumption and to change consumer behavior are much, much less developed. But nonetheless, as we'll say later, the Leeds Climate Commission is absolutely committed to addressing these scope 3 emissions, and they are our next priority in terms of the work needed to do that. And they will be published as a supplement to this report as soon as we can. So within the scope 1 and 2 boundaries, these are the top 10 carbon reduction options for Leeds. And they give you a sense or a feel for the kind of things that can be done. And as you'll see, none of them are rocket science. None of them are that novel or innovative, at least in concept. So the top one is insulating homes, domestic buildings. That's the area where we can deliver the biggest carbon cut. And obviously that means a retrofit scheme for our council housing, for our social housing, for our private rented housing, and for our owner occupied housing. Next up is the potential to switch from petrol cars to bicycle journeys and cycling. And then as you look down, the same number 4 is there for switching from petrol cars to walking. So what that tells us is we need an active travel strategy. We need a better cycling plan and a better pedestrianisation and walking plan. And then you can see some of the others. I won't go through all of them, but homes and transport really do dominate the top 10 list. The whole report accounts for, I think, 140 or so different low carbon options. And when we add all of those options up across the housing sector, in public and commercial buildings, in transport and in industry, this is what we find. So what we're looking at here is how to close the gap between the orange dotted line, which is where we're headed if we don't do anything more, and the black dotted line, which is where we need to get to stay within our carbon budget. And the lightest shade of orange towards the top are the cost-effective options, and they can generate 41% or close the gap between where we're headed and where we need to be by 41%. The next wedge down is the cost neutral options. So these are options that would cover their costs and probably generate a wider range of benefits in terms of cleaner air or reduced congestion or improved fuel poverty and enhanced public health. And they would add 11% onto that. So what that tells us is that half of the gap between where we're headed and where we need to be can be closed at no net cost. So there is no economic reason other than, we need to raise the investment, but the investment would pay back for all of those options, and half of it would be deliverable without any major economic impact, negative impact, I should say. Then another 8% are technically viable. So these are things which may not pay for themselves, but still may be worth doing, for example, because of the wider benefits that they generate. And then there is a 40% gap between if we did all of the things that we thought of that are included in the analysis and net zero. And that is significant, absolutely. So our big challenge is A, to do all the things we know about, but B, to bring forward a load of other options that we don't yet know about or that are a bit more innovative or unusual to address that remaining 40%. My screen is frozen, excuse me. Yep. So when we look at the cost of this, and this is significant, obviously, both because we need to invest an awful lot of money, but also because there are big economic benefits, and this can be a key part of a green recovery package. The cost-effective options, which would deliver a 41% closing of that gap between where we're headed and net zero, would require investments of £600 million a year through the 2020s. However, at the end of that, they would deliver cuts in Leeds' energy bill of £650 million a year. And at the same time, they would generate nearly 15,000 years of extra employment. So that's 1,500 jobs for 10 years. So even if you're not concerned about climate change, and you really should be, but even if you're just a hard-nosed economic decision maker concerned about green recovery or post-COVID recovery, for example, there is an enormous opportunity to stimulate the economy and to create jobs whilst also cutting our carbon footprint. However, at the moment, and this may not always be the case, from then on it gets more and more expensive. So the cost neutral options, which would only get us to 52% of that gap between where we're headed and net zero, would require investments of £900 million a year, and they would generate savings of £550 million from the city's energy bill, but they would generate 22,000 years of extra employment in the city, or 2,200 jobs for the next decade. And then after that, it gets more expensive still. So to do everything that we can think of, at the moment would require investments of £1.1 billion a year through the 2020s. And that would generate savings of over £500 million a year by 2030 and generate 31,000 years of employment. And that would close the gap by 60%. So still leave a significant gap between where we're headed and net zero. So clearly, a massive aspect of this is how on earth do we raise that level of investment? And that's a key priority, as we'll come on to later, for Leeds Climate Commission. So then the question is, what about the remaining 40%? And here we have, the prospect of a significant gap between where we can get to if we do everything we can think of and net zero by 2030. So the question here is, how do we close that gap? What are the options for addressing that residual, the last emissions? It's not minor, 40% of the carbon footprint, but what can we do and what are the options available to close that gap? So here we looked at a limited range, and there are absolutely other options available to add to this. But one option is to move towards zero carbon heavy goods transport. And lorries typically don't respond very well to electrification. And so probably we're thinking here about hydrogen-based heavy goods vehicles, and they could make a significant contribution. Also then looking at the electrification, the widespread electrification of industrial heating and cooling, of domestic heating and domestic cooking. So changing from gas boilers and gas stoves to electric boilers and, electric heating systems and electric stoves, and doing the same in commercial and public buildings. And they can add a significant chunk of decarbonisation. However, as electricity decarbonizes, then the carbon savings from other options such as hydrogen and hydrogen-based heating schemes, they are also significant, but they also fall, because if we don't use hydrogen but we do electrify, then the carbon footprint of that electricity is falling as the carbon intensity of our electricity falls. So all of those are significant, absolutely, and probably we need all of them, but there still leaves a residual. And one of the things we looked at here, not to advocate it as such, but to really explain just what a level of ambition and activity we would need to address the residual emissions after we've done everything else through tree planting, is that you could close the gap, you could get to net zero, but it would require 89 million trees to be planted in the next few years, because obviously they take time to grow and then start sucking up carbon. And even at the densest level of planting possible, that would require an area equivalent to 36% of the wider area or territory of Leeds. So imagine a third of the distance, or the area of Leeds being covered in really dense tree planting, and that gives you some sense for how much trees need to be planted to address just the residual options. That's not to say planting isn't a good idea. There are loads of other good reasons for doing it: flood protection, air quality, biodiversity, public health, including mental health, and so on. But to rely on it to really offset much of our emissions, I think ignores just how much land would need to be committed to doing it and how quickly that would need to happen. So if we did all of that, and there are other options too, then we could, we think, get to net zero by 2033. So, that's a step forward, absolutely. But we need some other options still to come through to get to 2030. So the 2030 target is undoubtedly ambitious, but the headline is, it is possible. Leeds can get to net zero by doing these things and others. And a lot of what it needs to do will generate jobs, tackle poverty, reduce congestion, improving air quality, and enhance public health, and so on. So that all massive benefits and a key part of a green recovery package. So instead of asking, why would we do this? I think it's more, why wouldn't we do this? There are such amazing benefits there. It's a great way to develop the city for all sorts of other reasons, as well as tackling climate change. So to conclude, what needs to happen next, and what should the Leeds Climate Commission and the city more broadly focus on? First one, see this as a big opportunity and mainstream it into the heart of our policies and plans and visions for the future. So climate change can't be an add-on or an afterthought. It needs to be at the heart of our investments, of our transport planning, of our new house building, of everything we do. Secondly, develop and start to deliver net zero delivery plans for housing, for transport, for commercial buildings, for the public sector, and for other areas such as industry and waste. And the Commission is absolutely doing that, especially focused on housing and transport. Next, focus on community engagement. The citizens' jury was a massive inspiration to all of us, really energized everybody, and has guided the production of this version of the net zero roadmap. But we need to build the social license for transformative change. We need to get everybody on board and take people with us on this journey. And crucially, we need and fair transition. I think some people have very legitimate concerns that their jobs will be at risk or they will be disadvantaged some way, and we need to convince people that no one and nowhere will be left behind in this process. And that means channeling some of the good things towards the areas or the people and helping them to transition, and so that they're not left behind in this process. Next, to explore options for finance and investment, and to have a clear plan for employment and skills provision. And there are massively exciting aspects available or emerging in this space, but we have to be honest that they're not there yet. But things like community bonds and community investment could enable the local community to invest in their city and to help to deliver and benefit from the transition to net zero. And then lastly, and this is massively important, we need to expand the boundaries of all of this to consider scope 3 or consumption-based emissions, including absolutely those associated with aviation. And we then need to think about the kind of interventions that we can adopt in order to change people's consumption behaviour and their travel habits. And that's one of the main priorities for the Commission in the next phase. So here's an infographic that summarises all of this, which probably you can't read now, but maybe will be useful and interesting later. And I'm really happy to take questions on all of this later. But next up, really looking forward to hearing the reaction of two of our core members of the Leeds Climate Citizens Jury, who, as I say, inspired many of the changes that led to this, and their work helped us to intensify the level of ambition and to close the gap further between where we're headed and where we need to be. But that's not to downplay the challenges and the reality, which is that there's still a gap even after doing all of that we still need to address and fulfill. So I've run over time, which is a really bad precedent for a chair to set, but we'll start the clock running from here. So Adil and Siobhan, would you be able to speak for 4 or 5 minutes each, perhaps, on your reactions to this and the reactions of the citizens jury, perhaps more broadly, to this revised plan?
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to just say that it's just so fantastic to see that over 12 months after the jury's launch event of our finalised recommendations, that those recommendations that we collectively brought together, they've not been forgotten about and continue to influence this huge project that Leeds Climate Commission are undertaking. So it was particularly encouraging to see in the roadmap that key sectors mirrored the areas that we chose as a priority in the citizens' jury, in particular housing, transport and industry. What might be a little bit less encouraging is that the jury looked at aviation within the scope of transport. It's worth a reminder that 86% of the jurors were against the expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport, as the associated emissions could offset the savings of all the other recommendations put forward. And this would mean that ultimately we would not be able to meet the target of net zero by 2030. However, it is noticed that whilst aviation is outside the scope of this roadmap, as Andy you have touched on in your presentation, and it will be extended in the near future to include scope 3 emissions. So I'm sure that I can say on behalf of all the jurors that we're really looking forward to seeing the next steps that the Commission are going to take to address these significant emissions and what these potential mitigations options may entail. I believe Adil's got something as well to add to this.
I do, yes, thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what she just said in terms of, I guess it's really good and really encouraging to see progress being made and how sort of our recommendations are being directly addressed. And again, I guess how we've been sort of asked to come back and give our reaction is good to see. And I guess what I would like to say is to sort of urge the continuation of just that communication, sort of keeping people in a loop, and then sort of more broadly sort of making sure that whilst we have all these plans, we also ensure that we're engaging everyone, not just the people that are interested, but everyone as in the wider public, and how we consider different ways to reach different people who may not be fully engaged with the issue, because ultimately we need everyone to come on board. So I would just urge that we continue to have a focus on communication. And I guess I would sort of just like to ask sort of maybe a question from us, from the jury, in terms of the 40% gap. Like, do we have any proposed timelines on any sort of decision-making criteria in terms of how those decisions may possibly be made, and to sort of give us some context and just sort of make sure it is actually addressed? But yeah, again, just to reiterate, I guess we're quite happy that you are making progress. There's a lot happening, there's a lot of positive things, and just sort of just keep that communication going. Like Siobhan mentioned about the airport and the scope 3 emissions, if you can get that some sort of progress on that, and then just sort of, yeah, just some context and decision making. But yeah, it's just a quick short update from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. That's really useful. Can we then turn to Polly Cook, who will give us a quick reaction from the Leeds City Council? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I think the plan's great, that it sets out the size and scale of the challenge really clearly and really helps to focus, I think, everyone's mind, provides a really helpful way to prioritise in terms of kind of the economic and the carbon aspects. I think one of the key challenges, which I think has already been alluded to, is actually recognising the behavioural change that's required on some of those. So we prioritise on economic and carbon, but some of them have quite a large sort of societal shift that's required. And again, I think it emphasises the feedback from the citizens jury members in the sense of that need to bring people with us in order to achieve what's been set out. Andy also asked me just to have a kind of cover some of the things that are actually happening that are supporting those different objectives. So when we think about what's happened during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of changes in behaviour, a lot more in terms of shopping locally, more active transport, people really getting to know their own neighbourhoods. And one of the sort of positives that has come out of it is this green recovery, in terms of the way the government has sort of decided to focus some of the funding coming out. So from a public sector point of view, there's been a fund of £1 billion that's been launched for all public sector buildings around retrofitting. The scheme has been really oversubscribed. I don't know to what extent at the moment, that's not been published. But Leeds has actually put in for 25 million just from a council perspective from that fund, and many other partners across the city have also put in for that. And I think that shows that there's the ambition and the willingness to do it. Quite often around public sector, the funding does become challenging, and some of the measures that we're seeing do have quite long paybacks. But what you would see if we're successful on that funding is a real step change in terms of the way that you might see a leisure centre being powered using things like heat pumps and solar panels, and really starting to get down to that net zero where we're aiming for. In terms of housing, there's been a similar fund, so there's £2 billion, so 1.5 billion of that is directly for the public to apply for their own housing. But there's also funding that we've been able to apply for private housing and also for our social housing. And so far we know we've been successful for £10 million. We already have £24 million in the pipeline for this year, so that those two funds will come together, and it will allow us to help over 5,000 homes, which will be the least efficient in the city. And also the kind of the lowest income houses, and allow us to really start to make some step changes and show how that can be done. And just touching on transport, in December the executive board, we took our transport strategy, and that is now open for public consultation, so you can either find it on the Connecting Leeds website, or I can maybe put in the chat the actual link to it later. But the fundamental principle is supportive of what we've just seen in the report. The vision for Leeds is to be a city where you don't need a car, and looking at a decrease of car journeys by 30%, and some of that being replaced by public transport, by bike and by walking. So all supportive, I think, of what Andy's saying. We've also recently published the White Rose Forest strategy, which again I think supports what Andy says. that we are not relying on that in terms of offsetting, but we see it as a part that complements, brings many other benefits, with an ambition to increase tree canopy from the current 17% to 33% by 2050. And so that's just been launched again in December, and we're starting to pull that together. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying I think engagement is absolutely key to success, and I think there's more work to do on that. We have the Leeds by Example website, which I'd encourage people to look at and feedback to us on. We have a monthly newsletter where the subscriptions to that are going up regularly. We also have the Twitter account with followers. And obviously this year has been quite difficult to go out and do more of that face-to-face engagement, but obviously that is something we will be looking at once we get back to a bit more normality. And again, one of the key things is around the policy changes that are required at a central level around decarbonisation of heat, planning, some of the housing sector, and just to pick up in terms of things like, for example, we've got the cost-effective and cost-neutral methods. The challenge that you might have, for example, in an owner-occupier property is that they are cost effective or cost neutral over a timescale, but sometimes people don't know how long they're going to stay in the property. So looking at those financial solutions for that are really important. So I'll leave it there, Andy, because I'm sure lots will come through on questions as well, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Polly. Next up, Liz Edgington from Business in the Community.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen. I have some slides. Is that working?
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. So, sorry. Sorry, there we go. Right, so I'm from Business in the Community, where I'm the Environment Advisor for the UK. I'm based in Leeds, though, where I've lived and worked for many years, hence my being on the commission. So this is a business response to this report, and well, from a business perspective, surely this report can only be a positive thing. Efficiencies, investment opportunities, job creation, fantastic opportunities. Where do we all sign up? But obviously there are many challenges as well, and it's very complex business. So where is business now on its net zero carbon journey at the moment in the UK and therefore also Leeds? It's perhaps a mixed bag. So 45% of FTSE listed companies are now committed to net zero by at least 2050, but only 16% have actually got a robust strategy to meet this. And only 33% have a target to reduce those scope 3 emissions that Andy was referring to earlier. So the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that far-reaching consequences of being underprepared. So it is really vitally important that businesses understand their future risks and put in place strong mitigation plans, and this applies to climate change too. So if we look at how well they're actually playing on this, on net zero, looking at science-based targets, which is a science-based target you can adopt a science-based target as a company, as an organisation, as a country or a city. It's one that is in line with the pathway to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees, as advised by climate scientists, preferably 1.5, of course. And only 127 UK companies have set or committed to set a science-based target. That's about 10% of them worldwide. This number is low, but it's growing all the time. And as a percentage, the UK is one of the countries leading the way to a zero carbon economy. But clearly this isn't enough, and we need exponential growth and adoption of these targets because it gives lots of learning opportunities. We do have a key drive for best practice for business is increased pressure from investors who are demanding greater transparency. And we do have some legal requirements coming into play now that are really sort of driving that one forward. So hopefully we'll see some good action forward from those companies. But, they are mostly the larger companies that are being affected by those things. We really do need to find a way to work with the smaller companies as well. So if we think about the Leeds plan you've just presented, thank you, Andy. Absolutely brilliant, really fascinating. It's a fantastic opportunity for Leeds businesses to benefit from the improvements in the area that, you know, will come through this plan. And we need to find a way, though, to ensure that those cost neutral options identified are adopted, not just the cost effective options. And I think, you know, this might be about new finance arrangements, for instance, extending payback periods, things like that. We need to find ways to engage businesses on this and make that part of how they do business. And we need to provide real clarity about the future business opportunities, you know, down to a bit more of a granular level, I think. I think it's interesting to see that the cost effective and cost neutral options and even the technical potential options for industry are so much lower now than the other sectors, because quite a lot of that action has taken place. There's still lots to do, but we have seen some action already. And we need to get that same motivation level for some of the other sectors, particularly the domestic sector. Could a business solution help? We need to see efficiency become, you know, the business be seen as the business opportunity that it really is. How can we incentivize efficiency to be a key way to spark investment? Things like energy performance contracts, perhaps, or something like that, just to really kind of push that forward and get that movement as fast as possible. I was really glad to see that every one of the top 10 carbon or cost-effective emission reduction options that you identify in the report can be adopted by or supported by business. And thank you for this really useful guidance to drive impactful change. It's something we can definitely, you know, I can definitely work with businesses on. I'm sure they'll be that grateful for that, for that clarity. It's important to understand that not all change will directly be within the realm of business, but can be supported by business. And this could be through investment, through policy and operational changes, and by using influence to challenge and support changes in behaviour throughout the value chain. So we've got to really make sure we drive that activity throughout the business value chain. And then lastly, just looking at those challenges to a green recovery package coming out of COVID. So interesting, those climate really has to be central to the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic to avert the climate crisis and safeguard future business. And that is becoming more, very clear to business. A survey by E.ON actually found that 72% of businesses are re-evaluating their environmental priorities due to the pandemic, with the majority of those questioned believing that businesses will be the main driver in a green recovery. So that's good to hear. Some more general issues perhaps to consider. Household carbon emissions and energy bills are increasing, with over half the UK's workforce currently working from home. Increases in bills estimated to be around £107 this winter for those people. So when thinking about net zero, companies now need to consider not only their own emissions in their operations and supply chains, but also the impact of their employees. So this, this is the employees working from home. So as this will actually be part of their scope 3 emissions now. So this is a real driver for business to support domestic efficiency investment. And I think that's something we could perhaps look at, building on. And I've talked to quite a few companies who are interested in looking at that. They are the forward-thinking companies, but this can grow. So in the future, most businesses are likely to have a hybrid approach of working both at the office and home. So engaging staff is going to be really important to mobilising employees to manage those scope 3 emissions. So it's another good way that we can perhaps bring business on board to help with those domestic emissions. So just thinking quickly about energy, UK electricity demand will double over the next decade to 2030. So businesses, again, thinking about efficiency, really need to be taking on that efficiency challenge, making it a key part of the way they do business, but more really looking for commercial opportunities. And also thinking about renewables, making sure those are really investable opportunities. We're going to need to quadruple our investment in low carbon energy if energy is going to rise that much, but maybe with some of these efficiencies we can manage that. But quite a lot of that is about electrification of transport, which is a positive thing, but is going to put huge pressure on low carbon energy demand. So businesses might be able to help with that by perhaps assessing where they could potentially use other ways of being mobile and their logistics, and thinking about alternatives and perhaps supporting different modes of travel or distribution or whatever it is to meet this ambition. you know, including just about, you know, not traveling and things like that. So, and finally, yes, a just transition, really important, especially about including, you know, ensuring there is good employment for those displaced from carbon intensive industries. This will not be a good change if we don't make sure that it's good for everybody. And that's me.
Wonderful, thanks, Liz. And then lastly, can we hand over to Simon from Friends of the Earth, Simon Bowens.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I think it's response to this is I think welcome. But first of all, I think we really need to recognise actually what's at stake here. Climate change is the biggest problem that is facing humanity at the moment, and the scale of human and environmental cost if we don't tackle climate change is absolutely clear, with hundreds of millions of people quality of life being threatened, and that's particularly relevant in the global south. So I think when we're looking at the report, the identification of the cost-effective solutions and more generous options is clearly sound, I think, but we need to absolutely make sure that we use all of these technologies. We can't just actually just cherry pick the cost-effective ones. We need to implement everything, and decision makers across the city must accept that the scale of the problem means that we can't see the distinction between those two as some kind of benchmark for approval, whereby only the cost-effective solutions are implemented. I think the last 12 months have actually shown us that where we're faced with a huge problem, we don't hold back in the implementation of solutions on grounds of cost or difficulty. We get on with it and we make sure we tackle it as effectively as we possibly can. There is no problem quite as big as and challenging as tackling climate change, and we must throw everything at it to prevent the devastation that would ensue. I think there's a real kind of question around the carbon budget against the climate justice. We really need to understand that actually we in the West need to take a bigger hit of the overall global carbon reduction budget. We have a quality of life which has been built on the emissions of carbon. So we need to kind of make sure that actually our carbon budget reflects that. Some of the work that's been done by the Tyndall Centre, for instance, is recommending, based on that kind of just allocation, that we're reducing emissions by around about 13% a year, which is incredibly challenging. Some of the solutions which are in the roadmap are really positive. I think that it's clear what we kind of need to do. I think where we would potentially differ, and Andy's kindly provided the panelists with a copy of the roadmap before with some of the kind of levels of deployment. I think where we at Friends of the Earth would differ is actually in terms of the numbers of interventions that are being proposed. Friends of the Earth has done the analysis that actually of what we need to do in Leeds, and some of the kind of figures are ambitious, looking at upgrading the installation of 24,000 homes every year. Those would include the challenging properties such as 20,000 back-to-backs we have in the city. That installation would have massive co-benefits around field poverty, where still in 2020 we've still got 35,000 households living in field poverty, and as the kind of economic impacts of COVID hit, those choices between heating your home or putting food on the table become more acute for some of those families worst affected. We need to see that rapid shift away from gas heating to electric heat pumps. Rolling out around about 13,000 heat pumps a year in Leeds as part of our share of the Committee for Climate Change's recommended 600,000 a year. Public transport is key. We need to kind of have a massive uplift in bus usage and public transport usage. Polly referred to kind of ensuring that actually we don't need cars in Leeds anymore, I think the council's target of doubling bus usage in a decade is really welcome. I think we would want to see some of the kind of investment in making sure that happens. We need to stimulate that by adopting the approach made by Luxembourg, for instance, and providing free public transport access across the city. That requires us to kind of make sure that we're re-regulating the bus services in Leeds. We can start with the under 30s, but ideally rolling out free public transport in Leeds for everybody would be massively increase that kind of take up and take cars off our road, reduce emissions, and massively improve our air quality. We also need to make sure we're significantly increasing the provision of safe cycling space. We want to see in Leeds a cycling infrastructure reflecting that seen in Holland. At the moment, we're kind of looking at a few kind of segregated cycle lanes dotted around the city as a response to COVID. Actually, those need to be made permanent, and that network expanded to ensure that people feel confident, safe, in cycling around our city. I think we also need to make sure that the roadmap is integrated with the Committee for Climate Change's recommendations. There's some areas in the plan which aren't quite integrated. We also need to recognise the West Yorkshire Combined Authorities carbon reduction pathway, which is ambitious, and I think that we need to see the kind of integration and coordination between the two. We also need to see the political leadership on climate change. We will, after Councillor Judith Blake has been elevated to the House of Lords, congratulations to her, we will see a new leader at Leeds City Council, and they need to show and demonstrate civic leadership on tackling climate change, to engage the wider population, make sure every resident sees their part and their role in tackling climate change. Equally, in May this year, we will be electing the first West Yorkshire Metro Mayor. They also need to show that strong commitment and that absolute dedication to tackling climate change. The emission of the scope 3 emissions is clearly a challenge. I think what I'd encourage Andy to do and the team there is to accelerate that delivery of the report on scope 3 emissions. Some of the kind of emissions which we'd want to see in that are those associated with food. We need to see actually how we can deliver stuff in these which would tackle the big carbon footprint of what we eat. We need to understand actually how we use land to minimize emissions. How do we build communities in our city that minimize the need to travel? It's that kind of concept of a 15-minute community. And how do we increase and improve our natural environment and people's access to green space to reduce the impacts of climate change? I think the emission of aviation has been identified as a key challenge. We need to make sure that actually the kind of expansion of Leeds Bradford Airport does not go ahead. The Committee for Climate Change's recommendations before Christmas that there is no net airport expansion needs to be reflected here in Leeds. The planning decision on airport expansion is a key litmus test for the council, and on the ambitions for Leeds to become a low carbon city. And we must reject that application for Leeds Bradford Airport. We also need to make sure that there's no public money, which is currently the plan, being spent to facilitate that expansion by providing surface access links. I think the big challenge is how we engage communities in this roadmap. What's a delivery plan? How does the average Leeds person identify their role in delivering on climate change? Some of the work that's been done by Our Future Leeds, I think, is absolutely critical to that. I think that kind of wide rollout of community engagement, community involvement is key. And I think what we'd encourage is the Commission and the City Council to be working very closely with Our Future Leeds to ensure that that's reflected. there is a massive challenge for us. I think that it's clear that we need to tackle climate change as the number 1, number 2, number 3 priority. This report is a welcome addition to the debate, but I think there's clear that we need to see a robust action plan coming through, which of a delivery plan and how to get that investment into the city.
Great, thank you, Simon, and thank you for your perspective and your contribution. Really welcome. So we now move into the Q&A session, and just to reiterate, if you've posted a question in the chat function, perhaps you could move it into the Q&A function. That's the list we'll be working from. And if you want to go into the Q&A function and vote for the questions that you would like to see answered, then please do. Looking at the Q&A section, then the first and second questions and some of the ones below very much focus on Leeds Bradford Airport and airport expansion, and why the roadmap hasn't addressed those, and why the scope is narrower and when it will be expanded. So if I can address those, and here I'm speaking from my own perspective rather than on behalf of the wider Climate Commission. But to me, it's absolutely clear from a climate perspective, A, that there is a climate emergency, and B, that expanding air travel at that rate is going to make what is already a massive challenge even more challenging. And it's very hard to see how airport expansion or air travel expansion can be compatible or consistent with achieving our carbon targets. So the Leeds Climate Commission position paper made that very clear, I think, in terms of presenting the basic data on just how significant it is. That said, I think we need to focus on the demand side as well as the supply side. And in this report, we have flagged up, or in the presentation today, how much the Leeds residents' flights would add to the scope 1 and 2 baseline, the 21% figure. It's really significant. It's not the only major factor, but it is absolutely a major factor. And I think that it's very obviously entirely legitimate to focus on Leeds Bradford Airport. But if we just also look at the behaviour and the demand side, that raises some really tricky issues about social license and about what people want and what people are willing to accept, and whether we collectively have done a good enough job yet to persuade people to stop flying. And I think the clear answer is that some of us have, absolutely. But as the position paper makes entirely clear, it's not an evenly spread issue, that there are a small number of people that are responsible for a massive proportion of flights. I think 20% of people are responsible for, is it 70 or 80% of all flights? So, we have an equity and inclusion issue here, and I think we have to get a social license to address this. And I'm not sure we've done that fully yet. And I think that then puts the decision makers over Leeds Bradford Airport expansion in a very difficult position. I also think that the absence until recently, and it's still emerging now, of a national framework on aviation and a carbon budget, which includes aviation in there, makes it very difficult for a unilateral local decision in the absence of a national framework. So I understand how contentious and how difficult it is, but completely accept that this is a crucial issue. And as I've said, I find it very hard to see how we can meet our carbon budgets. This is me speaking personally, with that significant an expansion in air travel. I don't want to dominate this though. So Polly, is it fair to ask you for an update perhaps on where we're at with this, and whether Leeds City Council yet is able to say, where its position is, or is it still to be decided?
I couldn't comment because it's a live planning application at the moment, so it would undermine the process. What I can say is what we've put already in public in terms of, we're supportive of the things that Andy spelt out, that of a frequent flyer levy, of having a national approach to aviation, of making the most of the railways on some of those shorter journeys to kind of displace aviation. So all of those we're supportive of. I'm not on the planning panel, and I can't comment on the planning application though. Thank
you, Polly. Liz, do you have a view? Is there a business view on on air travel that you can feed into this?
I'm sure on a general level, there probably is a view that we might not like, but the businesses that I'm working with, which are large and significant businesses in our region, they would not support this. They would support better infrastructure for trains, and they would want to see alternatives for business travel and freight and things like that, coming through for us. So yeah, I think it depends on the business you talk to. But there is a significant number that would support other kinds of infrastructure improvements.
And Simon, from a Friends of the Earth perspective, what about the social license question? How do you deal with that challenge of building a consensus and taking people with us on the more contentious aspects, absolutely, of a transition to net zero?
I think what we're seeing is there is that growing awareness of aviation's carbon footprint and people's willingness to either make alternative travel arrangements, certainly to Europe, and looking at boosting the kind of tourist economy in the UK by staying at home or by staying within the UK. What is clear, I think, and as you've kind of alluded to, Andy, is that there is a social difference between the people who are flying, and it's quite a lot of people taking a small number of people taking more and more flights, rather than being able to kind of stabilize the position of aviation in the country by people at the moment kind of going on their one trip a year abroad, for instance. But I think what's also clear is there is a big social justice element to this, because it's not the kind of it's not the poorer people within our communities that are taking those flights. It's actually the more affluent people taking the flights. So as we are basically subsidizing the aviation in industry in taking up more and more of the carbon budget, but also being able to kind of provide the kind of public subsidy to provide airport transport links or surface transport links to the airport, that's actually taking away from the resources that we can actually allocate to things that we can improve the quality of life of people in our poorer communities. Actually, do we want to be spending money on building new roads to airports, or do we want it to be spent on insulating our homes and making public transport links more accessible to more people?
There's a question further down from Ian Fraser about carbon taxes, and I wonder if we can relate that to the question about frequent flyer taxes. Clearly there is an opportunity to raise significant amounts of money from, pretty stringent frequent flyer taxes that would address the equity issue to some extent. And you could imagine if we were able to recycle some of the revenue and invest it in domestic retrofit or tackling fuel poverty, there may be a chance to address two issues at once through policy interventions like that. Simon, sorry to quiz you on this, but do you see any scope from the national government at the moment to pursue those kind of innovative tax-based interventions?
I think there is. It's really difficult to say. I mean, I think a lot of the kind of government's current financial focus is actually on recovery from COVID. I think some of the kind of key elements, certainly lobbying around the spring budget and around the comprehensive spending review, to actually making sure that some of the kind of that the investment goes in and the public investment goes into tackling climate change. How that's paid for, I think there's whether there's that appetite at central government for those carbon taxes, I'm not quite sure yet. But I think it's certainly a debate to be had. Certainly as the UK's leadership in the climate talks this year in Glasgow accelerate, and we'd like to see the government kind of taking more of a lead and actually making sure that actually some of the kind of financial benefits, financial taxes that pays for this stuff actually gets loaded towards carbon rather than income.
I suppose, again, as a personal position, Brexit is a challenging issue. You know, maybe to some extent it's resolved. I don't think so, to be honest. But, you know, probably it's not all bad. And I see that there are two big opportunities from Brexit for the environment. One is around CAP reform and the agricultural policy, which everybody accepted, I think, was largely bonkers from an environment perspective. And, you know, now we're not constrained by that. Hopefully there's an opportunity for much more progressive agricultural support and all of the land management issues and biodiversity aspects that come with that. But the other, relating this back to the question, is around taxation, in that within the EU, it was very, very difficult to introduce carbon taxes because of the requirement for unanimous support. But outside the EU, maybe there is more scope now for the UK to adopt carbon taxes unilaterally. So yeah, my personal view would be, I don't see that anywhere on the agenda of Treasury or, you know, of government more broadly. But I think that there are opportunities, undoubtedly, and I don't think they're local, but I think they are national level opportunities to use the tax base as a way of tackling some of these challenges. Liz?
Yes, just really briefly, some businesses, and I mean only some, but some are already experimenting with using carbon taxes as a way to actually control various activities in their organisation, particularly including travel and other sort of logistics. So there is some experience there with that, and quite interesting that that people are adopting that as a way to control their carbon emissions using a tax. It's an internal tax.
I think, Andy, I think your point about kind of the European dimension is potentially correct. I think what we need to look at is some of the levers that the UK government have had within when we've been inside the EU, things like vehicle excise duty, action and road user charging. They've been historically very reluctant to increase those. I think that pressure needs to build on central government to actually take some of those steps to actually make sure the stuff that's within their remit gets delivered as well.
Absolutely. I think on that and so many other issues, the UK government is often hidden behind the EU rather than being honest about what they could and couldn't do whilst within the EU. But yeah, maybe that will change to some extent now. There are some related questions further down about Scope 3 emissions, which we'll come to in a second. But the next question on the list is from Andy Goldring. How do we shift or bring about more finance and resources into support urgent practical action on the roadmap? Polly, there's also a question further down about green bonds and related aspects. Can you perhaps say where we're at on those issues and what the view of the council is in terms of stimulating investment?
Yeah, no, so we were progressing green bonds ready to launch pre-Christmas, and it was about the same time the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund launched. And so we've had to just put it to one side, but it is still in the pipeline post-January to actually launch a green bond scheme. And we've been working with, so Tom Noland, who has been involved in all of this, has been leading on setting up the green bond scheme for Leeds, where we promote it and allow for investment in things, primarily things like solar panels, where there is actually a payback, and to allow, so primarily we were looking at kind of on public sector buildings, but then looking to see if we could spread that out further to things like community assets. So
thank you. Simon or Liz, do you want to say anything on this point? Don't feel you have to.
I think sorry, Liz, but there's a big emphasis on central government to actually give that long-term certainty to investors. To actually, there's a real clear plan of action, clear trajectory that investment can follow. One of the big one big frustrations, I think, certainly in terms of energy efficiency rollout, is the very kind of short-term nature of some of the kind of funding streams. So we're looking at the Green Homes Grant, which is kind of the much heralded by Rishi Sunak, £3 billion. The challenge that it had that the energy efficiency industry were facing, that it had to be done by March. That's now been extended for another year. But actually, that kind of, if we're wanting to build a supply chain, a base that actually can deliver at the scale that we're needing to do, it needs to be a much longer term vision than the next 18 months, 2.5 years, because that's in order to kind of build up the apprentices, build up skills in the industry, we need to see actually a 10-15 year plan with funding streams attached to that. We're not getting that at the moment, but hopefully the comprehensive spending review later this year will deliver that.
I mean, I see that there's an absolute revolution in investment coming, down the pipeline, and there are pressures now that are, required in law to actually understand what the climate risks are of investments and to report on these by our larger businesses. And, it has come as quite a shock to quite a number of those organisations, if I'm being honest. Many are very well prepared, but not. And I think, this should, I hope, really, really start to see some change, but it's not going to be quick, I think, but it will happen. And I think once it does start happening, it might happen after that. But
I think just quickly, before we open it up more broadly, I've been involved in 2 conversations this afternoon on finance, and Leeds Climate Commission will be establishing a new finance and investment panel to focus on this, because it's one of the biggest challenges, undoubtedly. But I think the potential of green bonds beyond the green bond that's under consideration at the council at the moment is enormous, and the scope for community investment and for changing the way that the community, the place where we invest collectively or make our savings, and to invest that in local projects and to be able to swim in the swimming pool that your investments help to heat and to meet the job you help to create. The potential for that to transform the way that we connect to the place where we live and the community that we live in is enormous. And we hear regularly that residents of Leeds have £2 billion sat in their ISAs. If we could mobilise a big chunk of that into local projects that would deliver these benefits, then that would meet a significant chunk of the challenge and generate wealth within the community, that the benefits of that would stay within Leeds rather than being exported to wherever else. So for me, that's really important. And the Commission and the Council together have just won a grant to develop a low carbon investment prospectus. And we are just starting work on that now and looking at bonds, I think, is a major part of how we can finance this transition. Adil and Siobhan, I'm aware that we haven't come to you yet, but you're very welcome to come in if you want to, or we can wait until a little later and ask you for a response to all of the panel's responses. Which would you rather? If you want to come in now, please do. But if you'd rather wait, that's fine too.
We don't mind waiting.
Okay, so we will give you a good chunk of time before we finish to offer your reactions to the wider range of issues you've heard. Just quickly, the next question up is also around Leeds Bradford Airport, but around the timescale for publication of the Scope 3 emissions report. I think this highlights a broader question, is that despite the level of ambition that's needed, the level of resourcing is often quite short, and there are lots of competing priorities beyond the life of the Commission. But this is our top priority for the Commission, I think, at the moment, and we hope to be working on it within the next 2 or 3 months and publishing something early in the summer, we hope. But it's a technical area, and when it comes to greenwash and whether excluding Scope 3 is an example of greenwash, obviously, ideally, we would have included it already. If we'd had the time and resource needed, then we would have expanded the boundaries and done the wider analysis. But very few cities or countries have done this yet. It is still groundbreaking stuff to understand our Scope 3 emissions, first of all, and then to even more to work out how we influence them and change consumer behavior when it comes to consumption patterns. So, we are far from being alone in not having done it yet. And hopefully when we do it, we will be amongst the leaders. But I absolutely recognise the urgency of it and the significance of the timing with the decision-making process around Leeds Bradford Airport. All of those are completely valid, and we are working as hard as we can to address these issues. So hopefully you know, in 3 or 4 months' time, that report will be ready to be released. Next question is around food waste and whether food waste is in the top 10. Actually, food waste was in the previous version. It's partly a scope 3 emissions issue to do with consumption, and partly scope 2 to do with emissions from waste. So it is a significant issue, absolutely. Hasn't been overlooked, but when we do the scope 3 analysis, we will include things like food and food waste alongside other forms of consumption in that analysis. We then have a cluster of questions around transport and transport strategy for the city and various transport options in the city. I think when we look at transport, the levels of ambition needed to tackle transport emissions are huge, and the levels of behaviour change needed are also significant. But one of the things that comes through is how much of a kind of knotty, complex challenge that transport can be. Which comes first, the behaviour or the infrastructure or the investment, for example? So, you know, it is a challenging area. And one of the questions from Paul Chatterton is around the new transport strategy and whether the target of 30% reductions of cars is enough. I mean, the strategy has or the transport strategy and the City Council has as a target the desire to enable Leeds to be a car-free city. Polly, can we come to you and ask for your views on that and whether the level of ambition is enough, and then we'll come to Liz and Simon as well.
So I'm going to say there's going to be a series of really detailed webinars that are about the transport strategy and go through the kind of pillars of action within it. So one of those is about zero carbon, and that shows the workings in terms of what reduction in carbon the proposals within it will give. It also starts talking about some of the other actions that might be necessary to get us to a truly zero carbon network. So I think rather than me trying to explain someone else's work, I'd really encourage people, one, to look at the transport strategy, which I will put in the chat, and read it in detail, but also to attend and look out for some of these webinars where you can ask the people who've actually done all the modelling and everything how they've got to those figures. So
thanks, Polly. Liz, Simon?
Yeah, I think, clearly transport is a massive problem. I mean, over the last 25 years, transport emissions in the UK have basically flatlined, compared to energy, which has kind of fallen through the floor. Some of the work we've done at Friends of the Earth, commissioning the Transport for Quality of Life think tank is really kind of key to this. I mean, certainly the recommendations around providing free public transport for people will, I think, as we've seen elsewhere in Europe, really kind of take that 30% that Paul's kind of suggested and kind of double it. I mean, our analysis shows actually we need at least 20% reduction in car use, even if we kind of electrify the whole vehicle fleet in the next 10 years. And if we don't, when we're kind of looking up towards 60% reduction in car use. And that's across the piece. I mean, we're in Leeds, which is predominantly urban city. We shouldn't be relying on the car to get around our communities. I think one of the big problems is actually how we shape the city over the next 10, 15, 20 years. We've kind of predominantly focused on the city centre as a place to work and the rest of the city as places to live. We need to kind of make sure that actually the city transforms so that people have got services accessible to them. Kind of that concept of the 15-minute community where you can walk to your place of work, walk to all the kind of essential services within 15 minutes, I think is something we should be aspiring to, and something our planning strategy should be making sure happens.
I think too that COVID has really shown that many forms of travel demand are not necessary, and that online meetings and so on, there is huge potential for working from home, for participating in events like this from home. Maybe it's not as ideal every time as face-to-face meetings, but one of the challenges now is to lock in those behaviours as we emerge, hopefully, from the pandemic as soon as possible. But there's clearly a window of opportunity to, reinforce the 15-minute community, to manage travel demand through that approach. And then, I think the West Yorkshire Mayor also offers an enormous opportunity to push harder for the mass transit system that Leeds so desperately needs, to supplement or complement, the demand side measures, but also the active travel measures and the electrification of transport too. It will be really interesting to see how the West Yorkshire Mayor changes the dynamic of that debate, but clearly it's something we as a region have been waiting for a long time. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to push ahead.
All right. Okay, no, that's fine.
One more question, then I'm going to go back to the to Adil and Siobhan from the jury, is around homes and retrofit. And the question is that there are 340,000 homes in Leeds. All of them need a deep retrofit to reduce their emissions, ideally to EPC A or B, not just EPC C. And it's wrong to assume that the decarbonisation of electricity or energy supply will deal with this. And the jury recommended social enterprise, and the CARA assessment, the climate readiness assessments, flagged up the skills limits in terms of the availability of skilled labour to get involved in a retrofit scheme at scale and at pace. So what do we need to do in terms of homes retrofit and in terms of skills and training? Liz, is that something we can put to you to begin with? Maybe the skills and trainings bit in particular.
Oh, goodness. I'm not sure I'm exactly the right person to comment at the moment with that one. I mean, obviously it's very difficult because things changed so radically with other schemes in the past. So investments were made, training was done, people invest in their skills, and then things didn't work out long term, and people and companies were left high and dry. So I think the most important thing with all this is to really ensure that whatever we do, we make sure it's clear that this is a long-term project, long-term investment that is worth people investing their time, money and effort into. Just
absolutely. I think maybe one thing you were referring to there is how, clunky changes in national policy around feed-in tariffs, for example, really pulled the rug out from under some fledgling sectors. Yeah.
So we really saw so many people getting training on that. But it's the only way is forward. So we have to find a better way for next time and make sure that doesn't happen again. This is a permanent change, where people's skills are really valued in the long term. Yeah.
So, thank you. Simon, Polly, do you want to comment on either the retrofit or the skills aspect?
I think it goes back to Simon's point. I think the big challenge is the length at the moment of funding that's being supplied into the marketplace is all being done on 3 or 6 months or 12 months. So when we are putting together bids and looking at the job implications, it is supporting a lot of jobs, but it's not helping necessarily to create new jobs or new apprenticeships. And I think that is the real challenge, and it is that longer term picture and plan. And I think it also goes back to that question about, a lot of the measures are, they do make sense. Like if you were to put solar panels on your house, or if you were to get an air source heat pump. However, you have to know that you're staying in your house in order for that investment decision, if you're doing it financially, and some people will be. And so again, it's going back to how you put the mechanisms in place, which was tried through the Green Deal but didn't work. But I think we shouldn't be giving up, and we should be going back and looking at how we can make those investments, and also how we can make the technologies more accessible. And I think some of the things we're doing with the public sector decarbonisation fund, if for example we have a heat pump in a leisure centre or in a school, it starts to normalise some of that technology, and then it will make it easier for people to see that in their house. Whereas at the moment, actually, you don't see them in that many places. So it feels like you're really leading the way if you were to put a heat pump in your own home. So I think some of that normalisation through the public sector estate actually will start to help some of that retrofit as well, and some of the schemes that we're doing.
Thanks, Polly. Simon, a quick response. I want to keep time for Adil and Siobhan. But
I think, basically, we need to see a really kind of ambitious climate plan for Leeds, for West Yorkshire, which kind of gives us the clear trajectory. We need to see central government supporting the delivery of that. part of that will be working with the providers of further and higher education within the city in West Yorkshire. The Metro Mayor for West Yorkshire will have responsibility for adult education. If they're really kind of focusing on climate change as the kind of #1 priority, then that skills provision hopefully will follow from that. And we'll be skilling up young people within the city to actually be part of the solution and part of a flourishing city in the future.
Thank you, Simon. Can we come back then to Adil and Siobhan and the citizens jury? Sorry to have kept you waiting, didn't want to land you in it with any technical questions, but can you give your responses to what you've heard from the panel? Are you satisfied? Do you think that you're hearing the kind of things you would hope to hear to see the citizens jury's recommendations being delivered?
Yeah, I think quite a lot of them have been addressed. We've spoken a bit about public communication, and I think that was the third one in the citizens jury's recommendations. I can't remember, but it's definitely in the top 10. And just as Polly says, it's not just about sort of getting the word out there, but it's about normalising things as well, with the heat pumps as well. And then encouraging the public why they should take the bus rather than the car, because like we said, even if public transport was free, if it's going to take longer, are people going to do it if they don't know the benefits? If it takes them an hour to get 2 buses rather than the car 30 minutes. So yeah, we felt like we were really obviously well informed, involved, consulted on in the citizens jury, and it was just such a shame that we couldn't share that with the whole of the rest of the city, really.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Yeah, I would echo what she just said, I guess, in terms of it's good. There's a lot of progress, a lot of positive sort of statements, and I guess a lot of intent. That's good. But what I would like to address is a question that was raised around the airport, around how it's still a contentious issue. But I was just wondering that if the majority of the jury sort of laid out as a clear issue, in some of these sort of public sort of consultations, a lot of the public members already clearly laid it out as an issue. When would we get to a mandate? Like, what's enough to be considered an actual mandate where we actually need to, reduce expansion? It's not stop flying, it's don't expand, because that expansion would be detrimental to us reaching our targets. So I would just question that in terms of, yes, it's contentious, but would you not argue that there's already been enough of a mandate issued by the jury, by some of the members of the public? Do we need like a Leeds-wide referendum to finally settle this? Like, I think that's my suggestion. I guess in terms of sort of prologuing the conversation, we really need a hard stop where the jury has spoken, members of the public are speaking. Do we need to finish this off, a referendum for Leeds, if that's possible, logistically? Just because I think that's quite important, because during the meetings, it was quite clear that that had quite a big impact on the emissions, and we could be doing a lot of work and just neglecting something really important. So I would hope that we just continue to move the dial forward in that, and not sort of go back and forth and say, yes, it's contentious, that something needs to be done, and we just, need to get it done. But otherwise, quite positive.
Thanks, Adil. That's a really interesting point about a referendum. I don't know whether there's opinion polls or anything less than a referendum which would give us a sense of where public opinion lies on it. But, absolutely, from a climate perspective, it's a huge issue. There's no ducking it. And it's going to shape the future of the city's emissions and carbon footprint going forward, not only the city, but the region more broadly. I think that the demand side aspect is also significant, and that's absolutely something we will be addressing and looking at in the Scope 3 consumption-based work we're going to do next. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining. I'm really sorry if we haven't been able to get through all the questions. I also hope that you feel that the roadmap, even if it doesn't do everything, is still useful and does something positive, and we will supplement it as quickly as we can to address the very valid issues raised in the questions in the Q&A bar. To give you a little update, the Leeds Climate Commission is restructuring, driven by the citizens jury, to focus on some of the key issues. The main focus will be on housing and retrofit, and also on transport, and on finance and investment. And we will keep you up to date in all of those areas with invitations to participate in discussions as we move forward. So thank you very much. We've run out of time. There's so much more we could discuss, but thank you to Polly and Simon and Liz for being the panelists. I'm sorry if I landed you in it on a couple of occasions with questions you might not have been expecting. Thanks especially to Siobhan and Adil for continuing to represent the Commission. And thank you all for coming and for your questions. Yeah, there's an awful lot to do. I think the headline story is it's a massive opportunity, but we're still not doing enough to meet that opportunity. We all need to accelerate, and there are limited capacities that we need to supplement in order to do more to make sure we stay on track towards that net zero by 2030 target. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Let's leave it there.